to order, and I'd ask Don to take a roll call.
Mr. Montplaisir?
Here.
Mr. Peterson? Mr. Costin?
Here.
Ms. Johnson?
Here.
Ms. McCall? Mr. Jacobson?
Here.
Mr. Hendrickson?
Here.
Mr. Steen?
Here.
Mr. Gehrig? Mr. Redinger?
Here.
Dr. Mahoney? Mr. Grinberg?
Here. Okay. Again, just a reminder on practice, mute unless you want to speak to kind of minimize any background noise. And Don, I believe this will be your first at taking minutes and with the committee, correct?
That's correct.
So that said, I'm not sure you recognize all the voices. So when you have a question or comment, please state your name so Don can get that appropriately in the minutes. So make it a little easier if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Comments from anybody before we get started?
Mr. Chair, this is Executive Director Paulsen. Paul, would you mind having the agenda shown on the screen, please?
Yep, I can do that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, while Paul is pulling that up, I'll accept a motion to approve the minutes from the previous meeting. Item 2.
This is Chuck. I'll make that motion.
Montplaisir, second.
Moved by Hendrickson, seconded by Montplaisir. Discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Same sign, motion carried. Let's go to approval of the bills. On the screen shortly will be the bills on page 8.
Okay, this is Kent Costin reporting on the bills. Total bills listing $4,758,490. The largest, obviously, is the Cass Joint Water District. I think there's at least three large land purchases in there. Again, that's why that's a larger figure. You'll notice that Clay County Joint Powers Authority has turned in some expenditures. There's a list of those items attached to the bills listing. I don't have any comments on the bills, but that's what's being presented for approval.
Questions for Kent? Motion to approve.
Mr. Chair, Redlinger, move.
Is there a second?
Steen to second.
Discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Same sign, motion carries. Financial report.
Okay, this is Kent again. On page 17, you'll see the cumulative report for the project. Current 2020 spending of $20,072,135 and a cumulative life-to-date project expenditures of $554,749,655. And if you move on to page 18, one more page ahead, the net position, $84,014,568. So we still have a lot of dry powder at the present time. And moving on to page 19, we've expended about 21% of the budget. Looking at that with 33% of the budget year elapsed, so we're in good shape there.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair.
Got you, Rick?
Yep. Just a question or a request from Mr. Paulsen. I think last year we talked about moving into 2020 that we would try to complete those budget lines, the revenue budget lines by source of revenue. And I wonder if you can make any progress on that.
Yes, thanks, Commissioner Steen. We will update that for next month and have it shown as you've indicated.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
Further questions? Motion to accept the financial report.
On pleasure, so move.
Jacobson, second.
Moved and seconded. On pleasure, Jacobson. Discussion. Hey, Don, we'll have you take a roll call on this one. If I remember right, we do roll call on financial report.
Mr. Montplaisir,
Yes.
Mr. Costin,
Yes.
Ms. Johnson,
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson,
Yes.
Mr. Henriksen,
Yes.
Mr. Steen,
Yes.
Mr. Rudlinger,
Yes.
and Mr. Grinberg.
Aye. Thank you. Moving along. Joel, number 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I won't go over in detail the numbers that Mr. Costin had mentioned, but I just wanted to make a couple of notes here. You know, a lion's share of our expenditures to date have been for the lands acquisition program. As you can see, we have 71 million in the budget for forecast year 2020. We've expended about 16 million of that to date. Other notable items here as far as expenditures are concerned are for engineering, legal, and financial. Obviously, we have costs associated with the I-29 grade raise project and legal and financial for the financial plan and legal for lands acquisition as well. So as Mr. Costin had mentioned, total project costs to date are 554 million in forecast year cost to date of 28.76 million. Move to the next page, Paul. This will provide just a drill down to level 2 detail. As you can see, the I-29 grade raise project and Southern Embankment and associated infrastructure, as well as the PMC and legal, financial, and P3 procurement is where a majority of our costs are today. So with that, I'll just take any questions related to the finer detail on cost expenditures.
Questions for Joel? Hearing none, we'll move to item 6.
We have a number of contracting actions to report out to the Finance Committee today. The first one is for action by the Finance Committee, and it is Task Order 26, Amendment number 4 for work in kind. This is related to HMG services for the I-29 grade raise project, which is moving forward on budget. The $305,000 engineering amendment is contained within the budget for the I-29 grade raise project. So it is recommended for Finance Committee approval by the Executive Director.
This is Steen.
Go ahead,
Joel,
Rick.
could you just briefly describe what the work in kind designates?
Yes, certainly, Commissioner Steen. So the work in kind is a financial obligation to the cost share for the federal agreement with the Corps of Engineers. And so we are required to contribute a certain amount of dollars as a cost share to the Corps' total program cost agreement that we have signed with them. And so that's what the work in kind designation indicates.
All right, thank you.
No, Commissioner Peterson has texted me. Maybe that's him. Chad, are you with us?
Got it, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Okay.
I was listening on the other line. It's like no one's talking to me. Good.
All right, welcome. Wondering if you had a question on any of the prior items?
No, sir. I just made the second and it worked out okay.
Okay, all right, good. So task order 26 will need a motion. Any thoughts? Motion?
Costin, move to approve.
Steen to second.
Moved and seconded. Further discussion, questions?
Steen's got a question.
Rick, go ahead.
Hey, a follow-up, Joel, on the cost share. Do we have a total max on that for the diversion authority that we put in? And then where are we at with regard to that amount?
Yes, Commissioner Steve, we do. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. Paul Barthel, maybe you have better information you could gather for Mr. Steen at the moment, but we can gather that information and provide it to you.
Okay, yeah, if you don't have it handy, the next meeting would be fine. Just put an item on the agenda, because I know we cut a check for 54 million some time ago, or whatever the number was, and I'm curious as to where we're at with our total obligation and where we, how much we've paid in to date.
Yeah, that's correct, Commissioner Steen. And so there is still a cost obligation to that cost share, and that is being tracked in our budgets, of course. I believe the Corps has indicated that they will not require any additional cash contribution, such as the 54 million that's been contributed in the past for the 2021 forecast year. So there is a financial obligation out there for the DA that we have included in the budget. And so we will provide that information on the Finance Committee agenda for next month.
Yeah, thanks, Joel.
Yep.
Further discussion? Hearing none, we'll have Don take the roll to recommend approval for task order 26.
Mr. Montplaisir,
Yes.
Mr. Peterson,
Yes.
Mr. Costin,
Yes.
Ms. Johnson,
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson,
Yes.
Mr. Hendrickson,
Yes.
Mr. Steen,
Yes.
Mr. Ridlinger,
Yes.
Mr. Grinberg.
Aye. Thank you. Executive Director approved contracting action items?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a report out to the Finance Committee. We had a number of contracting actions that I approved this last month. The first three were for a zero budget increase, basically budget reallocation and extended period of performance. And then we had a few utility relocation agreements with Cass Rural Water for properties that have been acquired and services disconnected. And then we had change order for work package 43CD, Oxbow Hickson Levy Phase C and D. That was a closeout on that contract with a reduction of 52,000. And I believe there's one more, Paul. Nope, these get into the Cass County Joint Water Resource District approved contracting actions, and this is again a report out to the committee. We had a reduction for Task Order 1 Amendment 6 rights of entry and other land management services for HMG of $55,387. And this was a cost savings in regards to the contracting actions that the Cass County Joint Water Resource District did last month with their task order for services with SRF and HDR. We basically pulled them out as sub-consultants to HMG and had a small savings to the budget in that regard. And then the last section was MCC JPA, and we did not have any approved contracting actions this last month. So.
Any
I'll
questions?
take any questions. Yep.
Any questions for Joel? Okay, we'll move into item 7, which is A, B, C, and D. As we shared last month, we would come to the program budget status. Martin, is that you? All right, Martin, you going to take this, or who's got the program update budget?
This is Martin. I can take that and provide comments if you want. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Did you want to share the tables? I can go through a general discussion of the results of that budget
Yes.
refresh item.
I think that would be helpful for everyone.
Okay. Paul, if you could get those up. Start with the budget status spreadsheet.
Mr. Chair, this is Executive Director Paulsen. Maybe you just want to note that Mayor Mahoney joined the meeting.
Yeah, we saw his smiling face on the screen for a nanosecond until he muted.
Okay, I've been told at times my connection gets bad, so please interrupt me if it's not clear. On the screen is what we have called the budget refresh as requested. We have worked with the PMC to complete a review of the costs, and this is a comparison for the $2.75 billion 2018 cost budget compared to expenditures through the year-end 2019, which was the date at which the cutoff was chosen for this exercise. The table shows that in aggregate, the program is tracking well, approximately $5 million under the expected costs. And that's, there are some pluses and minuses on the individual line items. But in general, I think that's a very healthy report with respect to pretty close to $490 million worth of expenditures to date against that budget, and being within $5 million is I think, attractive and good performance. The pluses and minuses are largely the result of soft costs moving from bucket to bucket. As Joel described earlier, there are some big negatives in program management as subcontracts were moved out from under Jacobs, and pluses like in lands where those direct contracts were made with AE2S. So don't get too excited about the line items, because it would take some explaining to get into the detail of what drives those individual numbers. But I think at this stage, the $5 million is a good report. There is in addition to that, there's a contingency summary that we reviewed, and this is for basically reporting what was presented to the board back in 2018 when the 2.75 billion estimate was completed. There's approximately $256 million worth of contingency in the 2.75 billion budget. You can see about 118 million of that is aligned with the Corps and the federal work, the remainder being part of the Diversion Authority obligations. So no contingency has been allocated as of yet, so all of this contingency is fully available as the program moves forward. Couple of general comments. While we do see good performance with respect to budget, there is a tremendous amount of project work left to do. We only have about 20% of the project expended, and while most of the original in-town work is complete, as you can see on the previous table, the River Stage 37 Plan B projects are just ramping up. The majority of core construction has not been bid, and of course our largest construction package, the P3 contract, is scheduled to be bid this fall. Obviously we have the impacts of COVID-19, and we don't know what those final impacts will be, and while we expect to experience some revenue impacts, not necessarily cost impacts, we're optimistic that those impacts will be short-term and will not affect the long-term affordability of the project. So I make those comments just to put into perspective that while the report is good, I think the Diversion Authority must remain diligent with respect to budget and moving forward. So I can take any questions with respect to those two tables.
Questions for Martin?
Mr. Chairman, this is Rick.
Rick?
So we had a brief discussion, Martin, on the contingency issues at some time ago. And, you know, you've got the contingencies for the P3, you've got contingencies for the core work, and then kind of try to narrow it down to about $1 million or so that are diversion authority or local obligation. We talked about a number that was a contingency for that. And do you recall what that number was? It wasn't a real high number. It's like 74 million or something like that. I just can't remember the number, but.
Well, if we do quick math here, you have roughly 256 million in total contingency in the budget. You have about 118 of that, which is aligned with the core. That leaves about 138 million remaining in terms of cost contingency. What you might be recalling is we had a discussion about the overall financial plan and model, which has different variability in it with respect to interest rate and revenue variability. And so depending upon your perspective of how you treat that variability, you could have a range of remaining contingency that is not cost-based, but is, you know, project revenue-based. I believe the intent to get the P3 bid and in the books is the next major step, and then we would revisit the project financial plan and contingency numbers to make sure that the outlook still looks as good as it does today. But I think that may have been the conversation you're recalling, Rick.
Yep. Yeah, because if I recall, you know, we were talking about it, that the contingency, and we kind of broke it down, wasn't as significant as we might have been thinking. And so we talked about having to be, like you talked about, a little vigilant as far as the budget and that type of thing, but I don't have that information in front of me, unfortunately, but it wasn't a big number. It didn't seem like a big number relatively, you know, relative speaking. But I could be wrong.
Yes, it does depend on again, this is a budget and cost evaluation.
Right.
The retool of the financial plan again accounts for some variability that we know is out there but has not been realized yet, and therefore hasn't been demand on the contingency. So I would say that the contingency for the project is adequate, but it certainly isn't robust or a large number that people can feel real comfortable that no matter what happens, you don't have to continue to be diligent on cost and cost increases.
Okay. On the budget, this is Rick again, I'm sorry, but on the budget, I know some of the discussion has been that we do have a significant I won't say issue, but be very watchful of the land costs going forward, if I'm not mistaken. And do we have adequate, given that, do we have adequate funds in the contingency to account for that and still feel comfortable with our contingency balance?
Yeah, I guess the response is that lands to date have been acquired within the budget. And in fact, we have managed to, and these are numbers that are not in these presentation materials, but we have, because of some property owners in a voluntary acquisition, have requested to buy the entire parcel versus the slice that the channel needs, for example. We have, in order to facilitate the timely transfer of that property, bought the entire parcel. Those are often referred to as remnant parcels. Those parcels to date have come in under the allocated budget, including the asset lands, we call them the remnant parcels. So we're actually tracking today well on land acquisition costs, and in fact have about, I believe it's in this circa $10 million of asset lands on the books that have been acquired for the original budget. There is a lot of land left to be acquired, and all of the mitigation properties and in the upstream and the flowage easements, I think, are where the concerns lie. And whether or not that process continues to move forward at the pace we'd like it to, or whether we have to go into other activities to get those properties through the court system if we can't come to agreement. So there is some variability there and some uncertainty at the moment, unless we, one thing that the Finance Committee could choose to do is to relook at the contingency number and relook at the budget, and it would involve modifying our financial plan to include numbers that previously have not we've not accounted for on a contingency basis. As I said before, I think the strategy has been to this date to get that roughly $1 billion deal in terms of the P3 on the books later this fall, and then take a hard look at where this budget and these contingency numbers fall with respect to what we know at that time. But certainly can take any look in any direction the Finance Committee feels appropriate.
Well, it seems that, in discussion, that there's the obvious is, do we have a sufficient amount of contingency given what we know today? We haven't any draw on the contingency. I get that, but we have some. I know we have some requests out there, some estimates, that type of thing, and it probably would be a good idea, at least from my perspective, to take a hard look at where we're at with the best estimate on project costs going forward, if we're aware of anything, and then take a look at the contingencies as well, and determine if we need to do any pencil sharpening going forward. I mean, we've got all sorts of issues with the finance plan. I get that. We've got sales tax, we got interest costs. We have all sorts of issues there. But we have, out-of-pocket costs, which I refer to as, paying the bill up front versus, what we owe on the back end. And so it just seems to me that a lot of things have changed in the last 4 or 5 months, and it might behoove us to take a look at where we're at with our forward-looking project costs, if there's anything out there we should be aware of, and if we have adequate contingencies. But if I'm the only one who feels that way, that's one thing, but that's just my 2 cents.
Other questions, comments? I don't want to put Mr. Montplaisir or Costin on the spot, but looking at their names on the screen, any thoughts from a finance perspective from your seats?
This is Kent Costin. The only thing I'm not sure of is how you've accounted for then the remnant lands. Is that off book or is that plugged in somewhere as a future revenue stream? Or will the authority simply hang on to that land and rent it out as a revenue stream? Might behoove us to know where that is in the budget. That would be one thing. And the other thing is if the program manager is declaring his contingency, the 255 million, and says that that's adequate, as long as all the other numbers are in alignment and we're getting full disclosure, I don't know what else we can do. That's my thoughts.
This is Martin with a just a comment on the remnant parcel values. They are, in your term, off book. They're not part of the project cost estimate. They have not to date been accounted for in the financial plan. Those are parcels and an asset that is available, particularly for consideration in any contingency related relook. That is would be an opportunity cost or a credit, so to speak, on the contingency line if you so chose to count them in that fashion. They are generating annual revenues at the time. I think if you look on some of your financial information, I believe it's in the $700,000 range of rent that has been accrued against those the leases against those remnant parcels. So there is a revenue stream that is associated with those and an asset value that is at the moment being carried off book.
This is, thank you, Martin. Couple thoughts. Items 7C and D are kind of intertwined with this contingency discussion. The Oak Grove amendment was, approved in prior meeting, but the more details coming forward from Joel today. And I agree with some of Rick's sentiments on another, I don't know if it's value engineering or further look at the project costs as we move forward. I think it's a good, healthy exercise given this environment that we've transitioned to with COVID. And I think part of this maybe should also tie in the sales tax discussion, because some of this is somewhat related to the budget, because sales tax is a big driver in the project. And so maybe while you're thinking more about the budget presentation from Martin here, maybe we can go into the sales tax and then come back for more Q&A, because I think it's important everybody understand, where we're at and have ample opportunity for questions. And I know Commissioner Gehrig asked specifically about the sales tax impact. And so maybe we can just have those two kind of bundled together and then give some time for more thought on the budget and then come back to discussion on the other items. Is that an agreeable approach?
This is Rick, works for me.
Okay, Mr. Shockley, I believe you were gonna remarks on the sales tax and program financing and.
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you. And I had some time to kind of think through all of the sales tax questions that you may have regarding the sales tax performance given the impacts of COVID-19 on the economy. So I think I'll start from a macro level at the state level and then move to a more micro level and address how it impacts our program, our financing program. So at a very high level in the state of North Dakota, there's really two distinct regions for sales tax. There's Western North Dakota, and then there's the eastern part of North Dakota. The western part of the state is largely dominated by the oil industry, and a lot of the sales tax revenues generated in the western part of the state are driven by sales that are related to the industry, commercial, and then services that are incidental to the oil industry. So in Western North Dakota, we are seeing significant downturn in the sales tax that's being generated. So when we hear about statewide sales tax numbers, because recall the state collects about 5% of the total sales tax that's collected locally, with the other 2.5% staying here locally. And so when we see statewide projections of the impact of sales tax, it's a little bit different than what occurs locally because Western North Dakota is so dependent upon the oil industry. As we move to the eastern part of the state, you have a slightly more diverse economy, and we've typically seen between 5 to 7% of the sales tax from spillover from the oil industry. But the rest of the sales tax collections in the eastern part of the state are really driven by entertainment, services, retail sales, commercial sales, and industrial sales. And so we have a diverse economy that is really provides some resiliency in the sales tax collection. Now, when we look at sales tax collections in North Dakota locally, the point of sale occurs about 2 months prior to the collections. So the collections that we're receiving in May were from sales that were made in March or approximately in March. And so last month when I was asked about this, I said it would be more appropriate to wait till May when we had our first real data points about sales tax collections locally. And that's simply because at last month we would have been speculating what the sales tax receipts would be. So first I'll discuss in our financial plan, what were the assumptions that we used for sales tax collection? You'll recall several years ago, we, with the finance leadership, looked at what assumptions should be made with respect to the gross of sales tax. In our original sales tax projections, we were using a 3% annual growth. That was based upon historically within Cass County and in Fargo, there were years that it was 6, 7, and 8% growth. The finance leadership determined that may have been too aggressive of a growth curve and dialed that back to a 1.5% growth. And that is a fairly conservative estimate, and that was built into the finance plan. And so we assumed a lower than what historically had occurred growth in the sales tax. And that was done to build in some robustness and to provide a prudent financial plan from the revenue side. So for 2020, respectively, we had assumed, and I think this is where it becomes important, we'd assume that the total collections at the city of Fargo would be about 49 million, and at the Cass County would be about 16.2 million for the total collections of sales tax. In the first 4 months of 2020, the sales tax receipts were very strong, actually stronger than we've seen. And I think that was largely due to the strong economic growth that has been occurring in the region. So remember, those would be from November, December, January, and February, all very strong months. And then now that we're getting into May, we're actually seeing what the sales tax receipts from March would have occurred. So at the city of Fargo, we saw a reduction in sales tax if you compare it from last year of about 20% for May collections. Now, that should be taken in the context of while it was a 1-month reduction, the growth in the overall year of 2020 thus far, we were up by about 10%. In Cass County, the amount of sales tax has actually stayed about steady from month to month. We did have a dip in collections in March, but just for example, the collection in April from the county level was 1,306,000, and the collections this month were 1,293,000. So, and I think that's probably due to the Cass County having a slightly different sales tax collection area. While it does include Fargo, it also includes the smaller towns where you probably didn't see as great of a reduction in business during COVID, during the most significant restrictions on travel that occurred during the COVID-19 orders by Governor Burgum. And so from my standpoint, We are currently, if we look at what we've produced versus what our estimate for the year is, and given we're only 5 months in, so Fargo is sitting at about 22 million, or about 44% of our projection in the financial plan for 2020, and that's 5 months in, and we've almost reached the 50% threshold. Cass County is sitting at about 7 million, or about 43% of the total projection collection. So I think two things. Number one, it was a very prudent decision by the leadership to recalibrate the growth rate to 1.5%. I think that takes into account the natural dips that you can see in sales tax collections. And number two, I think March, April, and May will probably see the declines in sales tax with a steady growth of sales tax after that. Based upon some of the models that are floating around nationally, there's sort of a prediction that sales tax will, for the second quarter in 2020, will be at its lowest point, and then we'll see a steady climb out of the sales tax receipts, or either over 12 months or 18 months, depending upon how fast the state reopens. So depending upon how the state reopens, the colleges and the schools and the academic centers, I think our sales tax may rebound faster, or it might be a little bit slower. But overall, I think that it will be fairly consistent with the projections that were given in the financial plan. So just as Martin had said, there's always puts and takes. One of the things that we did not anticipate that is a positive is that the reduction in interest rates that is occurring right now, we had originally predicted in the financial model a WIFIA loan interest rate that was getting close to that about 3% rate. If we were to close today on the WIFIA loan, it would be at 2.14% interest. So that's a significant reduction in interest rates. We're not anticipating seeing a lot of upward pressure in the interest rates from now till when we close on the WIFIA loan. So on the positive side, we're seeing a reduction in interest rate and the stable and what appears to be a stable stream of sales tax revenues. The other important thing to remember is that the local share is not simply a cash basis. It's the local share is largely being generated by borrowing. So you go out, you obtain a WIFIA loan, we'll have a number of SRF loans, and then we will also have the P3 financing. So you lock in that and you use the sales tax to repay that debt. So interest rate on that debt becomes just about as important as the actual sales tax collection. And then also, the other thing to keep in mind is in the sales tax, in the whole financial transaction, for the local side share, there are built into the different financing vehicles what are referred to as reserve funds. And so, like with the WIFIA loan, there will be a reserve. So if we see another dip like this in year 2030, the trustee would pull from that reserve, make the debt service payment, and then in the years in which the sales tax exceeded the projections, the reserve would be rebuilt. And so there's a lot of robustness built into the finance plan. And so, you know, as of today, with the information that we have, we feel that we still have a very bankable transaction. We're not seeing any serious issues with respect to securing the WIFIA financing, the P3 financing, or the refunding improvement bond financing. Now, if there are significant additional downturns in the later part of the year, we would have to take a look and a relook at it. But as of today's date, the downturn that we're experiencing was already, you know, the way we planned out the financial plan already took into account the possibility that you can have downturns, because sales tax by its very nature, there's swings in sales tax all the time. Anybody who works a lot with sales tax bonds will tell you that you always plan on reserve funds and you always conservatively estimate your revenue stream, because there will be good times and there will be downturns in the economy. And so the structure of the financing becomes almost as important as the revenue source. And I can certainly answer any questions, but I just wanted to kind of give an overview of the impacts of what we're seeing with the sales tax. I will, on a very positive note, I think that we're going to start seeing some increases in the sales tax, and I think that the May collections and the June collections will probably be the low part of the dip, and then we'll start seeing a steady climb out because we're collecting from internet sales tax. We're starting to see more economic activity. In monitoring the real estate industry, it seems like there's houses that are selling and closing and new construction starts. So it's all positive indicators. And I can answer any questions you might have.
Questions for John, Martin, or Joel regarding the budget, sales tax presentation? Nice job, John.
Thank you.
Before we go, hearing no other comments or questions, just a couple thoughts, and I'll ask Joel to step in. I think it was Rick that said earlier about, additional, cost cutting or looking for areas we can save. I believe, and I'm of the mindset that as we move forward, the Finance Committee is going to need to be more granular in understanding the changes, the proposals that come to us. And some of that's driven by this change that's gone on by COVID. So I think it's human instinct is to be more conservative. But, I think moving forward, we're going to have to be, deeper discussions on approving any increases to the budget, recognizing that the contingency, when you remove the Army Corps line item, it drastically reduces it. And I know there's other efforts with additions to this project that'll be coming, likely a number of mitigation issues, still not resolved on flowage easements. An issue with Burlington Northern hasn't been resolved. Hydrology requirements. I mean, there's a number of things I know that are being worked on, but as they come forward, I think it's important that we just don't assume we're going to take it from contingency without trying to figure out other ways to pay for it, if that's a desire of this committee or the Diversion Authority. So that's just kind of my sense of where we're at. We're in a strong position, but things can change if we're not careful, I guess. Things out of our control. Joel?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I would agree with your sentiments 100%. And as Martin had mentioned earlier, we need to remain diligent with respect to the budget. And I think this was a good report out of the budget refresh. Given activities to date and given that we're tracking 5 million below and we haven't touched contingency as of today. And as you recall, Mr. Chair, my philosophy in the past few months has been any cost increases, we need to offset those and find cost savings. And I think the Diversion Authority and the PMC and all the people working on this project have done a very good job of implementing that direction. And we've found a number of cost savings areas already, as was highlighted in Martin's tables there. But we need to continue to overturn every stone possible and be as diligent as possible given the current circumstances and situation. And I think COVID-19 certainly magnified that to a certain extent. So, yes, I would agree. I think we can revisit scope items. I think we can revisit some value engineering items. I think we can dig deep and overturn every stone in order to find potential cost savings measures that may outweigh and minimize any sort of mitigation costs or what have you, without resorting to the use of contingency.
Okay. This is Rick. I have one other question. I have a lot of questions, but I have another question here. It's on the agenda. I don't know if we're jumping ahead here, but on C, and this has to do with my previous concern, is that we've got this Oak Grove amendment for $7 million. Has that been taken into consideration in our on budget costs?
Martin, I believe you could answer that if that
Yeah.
was taken into account.
Yeah, Rick. The budget evaluation was against the originally budgeted items. So
Okay.
Oak Grove was in that budget at around $1 million.
Right.
And so the Oak Grove increase would, for all practical purposes, take our budget to at status. We're tracking about 5 million under. Within the ability to estimate, you'd essentially be at on budget by approving Oak Grove and moving forward with it. So it is still below the line, let's call it, part of that financial plan evaluation that we referenced and that John talked about. So it is not included in the numbers that were presented today.
All right. So I think you did a good job of answering my question. It's the 5 million, I'm paraphrasing here, correct me if I'm wrong, the approximate 5 million to date expected to be expended under budget does not include this $8 million that we are contemplating spending.
It includes 1 million of it.
Okay. It does not include 7. Okay, I'm with you.
Because 1 million was the original budget in the
Right.
cost estimate.
Yeah. Okay.
I thought though, Martin, there was some savings, so we actually covered the Oak Grove, because if you say it that way, aren't we $1 million over budget because you still have to put money in Oak Grove?
From a pure budgeting perspective, that's correct.
Yep. So, I'm going to go back to, Tony's comments and Joel's comments, and it just seems to me that we shouldn't rest comfortably with where we're at. We've got we've only spent 500 and some odd thousand of the budget. We've got a long ways to go, a lot of unknowns yet, and it just seems to me it would be an appropriate time to take a look at some of these things. Now we have a better idea what's going on, and see if there's any budget areas that we've glossed over that maybe we should do a deeper dive with. And Joel, I know you have some thoughts and some ideas perhaps, some areas we could take a look at, even if it's not huge dollars. It covers the costs, such as, maybe land costs, Oak Grove costs, that type of thing, if we can make any savings at all. And, so I just think it's appropriate that we take a deeper dive as you suggested. And I don't know if it's appropriate, at this point in time, even if it's on the agenda, there's a way to make a motion to direct you to do so. But I would, unless the chair objects, I would.
I'm listening. I'm tracking. I'm not objecting. I am. Maybe we can pause a moment, Rick, and then just have Joel confirm. On the Oak Grove, we're in essence affirming what we already approved, if I understand right.
But it's not in the budget.
But the DA approved it with more information that Joel promised to bring to us. That's kind of how I understand the Oak Grove.
I'm not referring just to the Oak Grove. I'm talking in general.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, I'm not saying we need to focus on Oak Grove. I'm saying here's just one item that we know is out there that we've identified that's not in the current budget number. That's what I'm getting at. We're there's evidence of additional costs out there that are not in the budget number. That's going to drive up some cost, either if it comes out of the contingency or whatever. And so I'm just saying, is it an appropriate time to take a look at project costs if there's any additional cost savings? I mean, we just,
Rick,
we
to answer
spent
that
7
question,
Yep.
I was under the impression that Tony instructed the team to come up with a budget refresh that basically has done all the questions you asked. Also, to Tony's point, we approved the Oak Grove amendment last time.
Yep, I know
I
that.
would assume that should be in this budget. That should be reflected, either you took it out of contingency or took it somewhere. We saw a budget neutral issue on the Oak Grove thing, Martin, that was presented to us before. So it shouldn't have any impact on the budget since Joel had some cost savings. And in those cost savings, the budget should have equalized on that. So I'm confused as why, if Tony's requested this is our final budget refresh, all that should be in here already. And what Rick's asking is really, it's another refresh in my mind, that you guys should have it all in this one today.
Well, let me add to Tim's point. I'm looking at two different paths. One, Rick's point, to continue to be diligent in our efforts to look for cost cutting and as we move forward. And then two, I guess I'm using the word affirmation so that we clear Oak Grove and not push it out another 30 days. Because I think it's pretty clear that, we support this. So whether that's totally into Martin's refresh present today or needs to be as we move forward, then I think that just needs to stand on its own. And then, as I've read the farmstead, that's that's a budget impact, and we know there are some things that we have to work on, and some of that's policy as well as moving forward. So I agree with you, Tim. I see it, but I see it two different paths. One, we need to move off of what we've already approved, and then set in motion continued diligence. Is kind of how I see it.
Well, I would assume both you and Rick are going to be diligent all the way through this till we get to the 2.75 billion. So if you let up at all, then we're going to take you guys to task.
Yeah.
Well, if that's the case, if you're taking me to task, then I would suggest to Joel that we do not a refresh, which is, I get where Martin did this, and that's why I asked the specific questions in Oak Grove. And I wasn't questioning the Oak Grove project at all. I knew we had approved it. That's not what I'm getting at. The reason I asked is I believe the discussion when it says there's a current 5 million under budget projection on the refresh. However, once we throw in the additional 7 million for the Oak Grove thing, which we previously approved, that's not included in the 5 million under budget. It's not really about 2 million over budget, based upon what I just asked the question. So and if I'm wrong on that, Martin, speak up quickly, because I'm going to keep rolling here for a minute.
Keep rolling.
Okay. So there's other items out there that I know that we're facing that may or may not exceed the budget, that may or may not be dipping into the contingency, because I know they're out there. And at the same point, then, with that savings, if we know there's items that are probably going to increase our cost, should we at the same time be doing what Joel has done previously, looking for savings, how to offset those costs? And that's all I'm getting at here, versus just setting on everything we have and looking down the road, because I think there are still other issues we could take a look at in cost reductions of a project that is already underway. That's all I'm getting at, because I believe, based upon the information that's been shared with me, that we have costs that are going to be dipping into our contingency at this point in time that we're aware of.
If I may offer a couple of comments with respect to perspective on the absolute linkage between costs and budget and the financial plan. As John reported, the delta in the interest rate for the WIFIA loan essentially has the effect of putting money into the contingency pot from a financial plan perspective. So I think in addition to rethinking and making sure we have all the puts and takes from a budget perspective in, you may want to also do an evaluation and some scenarios on the financial plan, which starts to get pretty speculative. In order to drive an answer out of the financial plan, we will all have to come to agreement on what interest rates, what sales tax revenue escalation, kind of revisit some of those fundamental assumptions. I think one without the other is probably an incomplete picture. And John can chime in on that.
Yeah, I think that's right, Martin, because some of the assumptions that are built into the financial plan, so the cost side feeds into the financial plan, we take into account when the expenditures are to be made, in what year they're to be made, and what the estimated costs are. And then we apply the anticipated interest rates of the different financial obligations. And we have taken some conservative view on what the interest rate will be, because our crystal ball is sort of doesn't work very well when it comes to predicting too far out in the future. So we try to utilize a conservative interest rate on WIFIA loans, on developer financing, and there's always a risk that if we assume too liberal, meaning too little bit of a interest rate, and then the interest rate jumps up, there'll be a question, well, I thought we had more capacity in our financial plan. So we try to be a little bit conservative as we start to close out some, like closing the WIFIA loan, closing the P3 financing. You start to have a better indication of your financial plan. So I agree with everything that Martin said.
So, Rick, are you still thinking motion or just a directive?
No, I'm not going to make a motion at this point in time. I think there's more information that needs to be shared with the Finance Committee going forward, and so I'm not going to make a motion now. I do understand totally, John, the difference between the finance plan and the budget, and I do understand that if we save 25 million in the cost, we save more than 25 million in the finance plan. That's all I'm getting at. There's opportunities to do that, but I'm not going to make a motion at this time.
Further comment, questions from the committee? Joel, do you want to wrap up this discussion and how you'd like to proceed?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Great comments. I certainly appreciate the input from the Finance Committee, and I think we always have great discussions when it comes to ways to keep the program on budget and on track. And I appreciate John's analysis of the sales tax, and we're going to continue to keep an eye on that and monitor that very closely. I'd like to just let the Finance Committee know that we're challenged every day to keep this program on budget, and we're constantly looking for areas that we can value engineer per se, or cut costs. And I think it's even more important now given the pressures that the COVID-19 situation has put upon us. And regardless of if there's a motion or not, the Diversion Authority is going to continue to look at potential cost savings measures. And Commissioner Steen is right. There's a number of things that do provide unknowns at this point that we're dealing with on a regular basis. And we're continuing to try to run those to ground to try to get more clarity. I'd like to just point out, once the P3 bids come in, it provides a huge amount of clarity to the program. We certainly will be reassessing the program budgets at that point as well. I think this was a good interim task, and I thank Mr. Nicholson for working with the PMC to present the information to date. I think we can all be proud that we haven't seen any significant cost increase to the budget at this point. given that it's been almost 2 years since the 2.75 number was estimated and that exercise was complete. And so I certainly applaud the Finance Committee and the board for assisting in asking the tough questions and digging into the information at hand to ensure that we're delivering this program as efficiently as possible. And we're going to continue to do that. And so those are some of my last thoughts, Mr. Chair, and I think we could probably move on. So.
Yeah, I'll ask any others to chime in. What I'm hearing, great discussion, great feedback. I'm hearing the intent of it is still to look for areas to value engineer or cost cut as well as we move forward. So whether there's a motion or not, I think the intent is pretty clear that that's still something we're going to be very attentive in the future to. Hearing no other questions or comments, Oak Grove 7C.
Okay, Mr. Chair, as you had mentioned before, this was before the Finance Committee last month. That was the first time Finance Committee had reviewed the Oak Grove project and had a discussion about the potential cost increase. Commissioner Steen had requested, more information or more of a formal project budget amendment. And so what you have before you is a budget amendment to add an additional $7 million to the City of Fargo in-town River Stage 37 project program budget. And so those would be reimbursable costs to the City of Fargo for the implementation of the Oak Grove project. And so I'll take any questions or comments that anyone has.
Mr. Chair and Joel, this is Rick.
Yes.
I was confused when I was going through this because I voted for this to pass it last time, and I thought we already passed this. I think the issue is if you have more information available, that'd be great, but I don't think we have to take additional action unless I'm missing something, because I'm looking at the minutes and we motion carried unanimously to approve that.
In Commissioner Steen, that is fine. The last discussion we had at Finance, we did not have a formal budget amendment in the packet. And so I think the motion was to approve, and I'll leave it up to Chairman Grinberg to decide if we need to take action on this or if we just send this to the board for approval at the meeting tomorrow.
Well, without objection, we'll move forward without a motion, and then we'll have this attached to the minutes, this document.
It sounds appropriate, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Would this be part of the consent agenda, to Rick's point?
Good question, Mayor Mahoney. I don't think we have this on consent for the meeting tomorrow, Mayor Mahoney, but I'll confirm that and let you know.
Well, yeah, but I'd move it to consent because why rediscuss it? I think Rick and we all discussed it quite intensively last time and kind of intended to go forward. So if it's just a minute to your budget, you can get on the consent agenda and we can approve it. Otherwise, we bring it up again and again. And I think that unless we bring this thing up, it's done. So you're going to have all the Oak Grove people in the audience because now they think it's going to be rediscussed.
Sure. If there's no objections, we will certainly add it to consent.
I don't have any problem with that. I mean, again, based on what we set up prior approval, this is just, I use the word affirmation of what we already approved. So
yeah, that's correct.
7D.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. We have Mr. Dodds here to present the Rural Impact Mitigation Program. This was on the Lands Committee agenda as well this month, and Mr. Dodds can give the Finance Committee a report of some feedback he received from Lands. This is a new program that's being proposed, and so I'll turn it over to Mr. Dodds to highlight the program and talk about the issue at hand.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for the time today. I recognize it's
after 5, so I'll try to be brief as possible. In your packet on page 125, I'm sorry, 126 is a cover letter and then some supporting materials related to the proposed rural impact mitigation program. This program has been presented and developed over the last few months. We did preview this with the land committee last month and indicated we would be bringing it back this month for consideration and ultimately, hopefully approval by the diversion board. The land committee did review this earlier today and did pass on a recommendation of support to the board. Given that there are some financial implications, we felt it important to bring it through the finance committee as well. I'll give a bit of a background here. There are about 24 farmsteads and rural businesses that are impacted by the project. Currently, our standard process would be to do an appraisal and offer some relocation benefits to those properties. In North Dakota, there is currently no limit on reestablishment or relocation benefits for business properties. Recognizing that there's likely not going to be suitable farmsteads available for the displaced farmsteads, we've been challenged with the issue of how will we come up with a program to replace or reestablish those farmsteads that are going to be bought out and moved because of the project. And so we've searched around, we've looked at different state programs, different states, different projects. We were able to find a successful program in central Minnesota that was related to a highway and bridge project where they were trying to incentivize businesses that were impacted by their project to remain in the community. And so we saw some parallels with that program that was successful and tried to adopt those, at least mirror this program after what was successful elsewhere. And so what we have then is a program, Paul, if you're able to go to the next page, I'll walk through a few points on that. The next page outlines a few parts of this. Scroll down just a little bit further. There we go. So again, there's roughly 24 of these sites as we know of today. And of course, the number of those has been moving over time as the project impacts have been moving over time. This program would be for properties that are displaced by the project, where the owner is operating a farmstead or a business or perhaps a nonprofit from the displaced site. And we would provide some reestablishment benefits that would be above and beyond the appraised value and the normal or traditional relocation benefits that are provided underneath the Uniform Relocation Act, to allow those businesses and farmsteads to reestablish in a regional location. In the materials there, you see that we're proposing within one of the regional 4 counties. The financial assistance that would be provided to these displaced businesses and farmsteads would be in the form of a forgivable loan. And that forgivable loan, what we're proposing would be a period of 10 years. For the first 5 would be, the loan amount would be fixed at the full value. And then after that, it would step down 20% a year until it would fully be forgiven. And the principle there is that we are using taxpayer dollars to potentially build new businesses or new farmsteads. And we want to make sure that the taxpayer dollars are being used to allow that business to remain in operation. And so there would be a sort of a second mortgage hanging over those properties with this program. I've talked to Mr. Shockley about this several times, and he's informed me that he's had quite a bit of success with these type of forgivable loan programs in other locations, and he may want to add some more details to that. In addition, we know that some of these businesses or farmsteads are owned by an entity and then rented by a son or grandson or family member or that sort of thing. And so there will need to be provisions in here where the payment would be made to the business owner, but in order for them to be eligible, they'll have to make sure they give fair treatment to the tenant. And so there's a landlord-tenant relationship that will be in place in many of these. And then one of the other key provisions, number 8 there, if Paul, you could scroll down just a little bit further. How will we determine the allowable amount of the loan program? So we've been engaging with some experts from NDSU, from their extension office, and we anticipate leaning on those specialists and perhaps others as the uniqueness of the business warrants to have them help us define what is a functionally equivalent farmstead or business site. And what I mean by that is many of these farmsteads that are being impacted or have been added on to over 20, 40, or 50 plus years. And many of them include, say a dozen grain bins, for example, of various sizes and shapes, and a dozen outbuildings or various things. If you were to go rebuild that today from scratch, you would likely do it differently. And so somewhere, in between the existing farmstead and the new farmstead, there's going to be a functionally equivalent determination that needs to be made. And so, for example, if you had 50,000 bushels of grain storage spread across 12 different bins today, if you were to rebuild that, perhaps you would, build 3 or 4 large grain bins, and those would be considered functionally equivalent, and then, sort of help establish the allowable amount for this rural impact mitigation program. All the discussion about budget considerations, certainly understand those points. We have looked at the roughly 24 properties that we know of. And if I just focus on those properties, it's estimated that this program may cost us an extra $5 to $10 million above what was budgeted specifically for those properties. That being said, as Martin alluded to earlier, I think what we've found is that our budget for lands were generally in pretty good shape. Obviously, moving forward, we have an awful lot of land left to acquire, an awful lot of structures left to acquire. And so I'm not prepared today to give a full statement about the long-term health of the lands budget. But I do think that this program could fit within our current budget as we know it today, within, I guess, that roughly $5 to $10 million potential increase. The feedback that we have received about this program from the Cass County Joint Board members, we've previewed parts of this with some property owners that are impacted that we are currently working with. The feedback has been positive. I think the Joint Board members, they're certainly represent farm community, and they recognize the challenge we have with replacing or relocating the farmsteads that are displaced. And so they've given a very supportive nod to this program. And as I mentioned earlier, the Land Committee reviewed this last month and then gave a recommendation earlier today. So I will pause there. I'm sure there's a few questions, and happy to try to answer those.
Questions for Eric?
This is Costin. I had a question with regard, I know when you say functionally equivalent farmstead, there's the issue of betterments and all of that. Would that be managed appropriately? I'm thinking back to our track record with
yeah,
with previous project that where additional items were added and changed on the fly to drove our costs up. So I just wondered if you could comment on betterments, how that would be handled.
Yeah, thank you, Kent. I appreciate that question. As we've been working on the acquisition program for a number of years, we are certainly trying to learn from mistakes or have some good lessons learned in there. And one of those issues is exactly what you pointed out. We have rebuilt several businesses in the downtown area. We have rebuilt businesses and homes in the Oxbow area, and we learned quite a bit in doing that. And one of the the things we came across was the bids from contractors, for example. I think when we were rebuilding homes down in Oxbow, I think that there was probably some situations where the contractors didn't really have a super competitive bidding environment, and we were stuck holding the bill. And in other situations, there was betterments that perhaps it was hard to determine whether there was or wasn't a betterment, and we ended up perhaps paying for some of that. And so we've taken that into consideration, and that's really where we're looking for these experts from this group from NDSU, perhaps other business specialists. We may need to lean on an architect from time to time, depending on the situation, to make sure that what we determine is functionally equivalent has some backup and has some justification, and not only for our benefit, but also for the property owner. And then if the property owner chooses to put betterments in, that's great. If they want to do that, that's their choice, and they can certainly do that on their own nickel. But those costs, the betterment costs, would not be part of this program.
Thank you.
This is Tony. Nice presentation, Eric. Certainly have covered a lot of the detail. My 2 cents on this, at a high level, I'm not particularly comfortable voting for something 5 to 10 million because that's a big window. And so that's just on the surface, what's the number with our prior discussions of what the comfort level is. $5 million range is too big in my opinion. But I think it's, this kind of gets back to, the engagement of both committees. I think it's incumbent on the Lands Committee and the Finance Committee to be working hand in glove, particular. So whatever makes it to the Diversion Authority for approval has been blessed by both committees. I don't believe the Lands Committee should be making a proposal to the full DA without support from the Finance Committee on the budget side of this. And so that's just a comment. I think the Lands Committee prior had just moved that earlier to the full DA. And again, the details and the comfort of the Finance Committee of, what's the acceptable amount. And as a side note, from a policy perspective, whatever the asset level is of lands that we've acquired that we don't need, is that the additional amount the Lands Committee has within their discretion set by policy, set by the Diversion Authority to manage these changes. So those are the thoughts I had with this. It's not that I'm opposed to it, but I just, I'm cautious on the simple numbers, and then the policy side as well as both committees, how they work moving forward.
Yeah, I guess if I could just maybe comment on that, I understand your points there. And previously we had some discussion about which committee does this go forward to, and I guess the suggestion was it should probably go through the land, but I understand your point that there's a finance element to this. The comment about the asset lands that we own, I think Martin mentioned they're roughly $10 million plus or minus. We've been surprised, frankly, at the number of property owners who are wanting to sell more than what we need. And that's really been a good tool in our toolbox to close those acquisitions in a streamlined fashion. And therefore we end up having some, we own some land and we're collecting some rent on that. And ultimately we'll have some assets that we could dispose of via public sale. I think that's an interesting perspective you have about perhaps using that as our sort of, kitty of resources, if you will, to do other programs like this. I don't think those two things are necessarily related, of course. And there's some type of policy discussion about, is this program, given that we've already relocated a handful of businesses downtown, Fargo schools, Mid-America, et cetera, given that we've already done some of those programs, and this program here is really sort of aiming to put a bit more structure around how we do that. I guess there's probably a policy discussion as well about, is it the right thing to do at any cost? Is it the right thing to do at, certain costs? And, I guess that's not for me to decide, but those have been some of the conversations that I've been part of.
Mr. Chair.
Rick?
Yeah, it's just not to be a stuck record here, but a question for Martin and Eric then. Let's say it's 10 million because history would tell me it's going to be 10 million, but has that been taken into consideration, Martin, on the refresh of the budget?
No, Rick. Well,
Okay.
yes and no. It is a known credit, if you will, but the focus of the budget refresh was twofold. One was 2020 budget, and we've already, I believe, reviewed that 2020 budget but prior. And the other was the 2.75. Where are we compared to what we thought we were going to spend? These puts and takes that are being discussed are below the line. In other words, not part of that
Okay.
balancing act.
All right. So that 10 million could mostly offset then the risk and opportunity costs shown on your contingency summary for lands, basically.
It could be considered in a number of ways, but it is essentially you could consider it a contingency available for use. At some point, it will turn into cash as long as the Diversion Authority decides to divest themselves of those parcels, as Eric talked about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming that's what the 11 million is, sitting there in that risk and opportunity cost column for lands. It's 11 million if you converted that, I won't say to cash, but an estimate of what the cash would be. And then the 10 million, here for this program is not included offsetting that risk and opportunity cost. That would just be a detraction from that 11 million, so it'd be down to basically $1 million or thereabouts. I'm just trying to get clarification how that works.
So I'm not sure I follow exactly your question. Paul, could you put the contingency slide back up to make sure I understand Rick's question?
Sure. I'll try to explain what I'm thinking here when the slide comes up. And I'm just looking, the first question, is it in the budget? It's below the line. That tells me it's not in the budget. So I'm looking, when you put this slide together here, the contingency summary, we've got the risk and opportunity costs of P80, which increases the lands contingency by 11 million. Because we've got this lands we purchased that we could probably sell in the future. We've got rental, revenue, that type of thing. I get that. So my point being is, if we increase this project cost by 10 million due to this program, we would basically offset that risk and opportunity cost P80, or just increase the cost of lands by the 10 million. Either way, what I'm getting at, if you take that whole budget together, we would reduce the available contingency by about 10 million. If it's part of the cost.
If that math is accurate, if you did not consider the value of the remnant parcels. If you're considering the remnant parcels or the asset lands as an asset and you sold them, it would increase the lands, and you assigned it to lands and kept it in that bucket, you would increase the total contingency for lands from 36 to 46.
Well, I thought that was the 11 million. That was the risk and opportunity cost. The 11,061,000.
So let me back up for just a second and maybe when I should have explained this table a little better. So there are 3 columns: a base contingency, which you can think of as a percentage base contingency on costs, the way you would normally do a contingency for a smaller project. You've seen, 10%, 15%, 25% as a line item, and that's the way the CORS number is calculated. So that's the first column. The second column is actually an analysis where you go through both risks and opportunities, meaning risks would be things where your costs would go up if something happened, and opportunities would be, let's say your cost would go down if something happened. You then put those through a statistical analysis, and this analysis is a probability 80% likely that the project cost would come in at the 2.75. So that establishes that contingency. And we did that in 3 buckets, one for lands, one for P3, and one for a general program, which is the system-wide. I do not believe in that the purchase of excess lands was part of that risk and opportunity analysis. I can check on that to make sure if it was. If it was, then it was included in the analysis. If it wasn't, then it would be a direct adder to that line item.
Okay, then just to clarify, so in the analysis, and so I understand this page, by adding the way we add 11 million to the contingency is assuming then our land costs are 11 million less than budgeted. Otherwise, how do you add to the contingency? That's why I'm confused with that.
So the process is designed to help you select what level of contingency is appropriate, given what we knew at the time you put in the risk register. So it might be I know in there are mitigation cost uncertainties, and other items on land. The cost of a parcel was part of that analysis. Our estimate in round numbers, let's say, was $100 an acre, and I'm using numbers way far from reality so no one gets confused. And you might say land could come in at $95 an acre, or it could come in at $115 an acre. Those are the ranges that are then used to statistically compute an appropriate contingency line based on those estimates. It's probably a deeper topic than we can get into today.
So the contingency has not changed. 230, the base, and the 255, correct. That hasn't changed at all.
Correct. And I think the perspective that whether or not it was included in this $11 million calculation, the lands that have been purchased that generated this $10 million in asset lands have come in at or below budget. So it is sunk cost to a certain extent, and as you go further and further in the program and you spend more and more of your money, your contingency as a percent of costs left to spend grows. So your contingency today as a percentage of your remaining costs and risks is higher than it would have been at the start of the program when you have all of the risk yet to incur. So for lands, that $10 million of asset property has been generated off of the lands bought to date. Those lands bought to date are no longer a risk item. They're removed from the risk register. They are sunk costs. Right. So you could easily look at this as you have generated $10 million of additional contingency for your land budget because you have that much in assets.
So I'm going to ask Joel to close this discussion out if there's no other comments, and then what are the wishes of the committee?
Chairman, this is Costin. I had a question or a follow-up on that issue of the surplus land. I think the State Water Commission has a vested interest in at least 50% of that vacant land or spare land. I believe that to be true, but that's something we'd want to nail down before we insert it into any of the financial modeling.
Good point.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, this is Executive Director Paulsen. I think, Kent, that's a great topic, and I think we need to have a sidebar meeting on that to fully understand where those dollars would go if those properties were divested, and if State Water Commission funds were used to purchase the additional lands, and I think that is the case. So we would need to verify that. Just to maybe put it in a little bit simpler terms, and I think, Martin, you did a good job of clarifying those asset lands, but those asset lands are currently being tracked as assets. And as Eric has mentioned previously in the land committee meeting today, in this meeting, I believe the lands program is on budget as of today, despite the purchase of the additional lands. And so I think treating those as a potential contingency is appropriate as long as we answer the questions that Mr. Costin just brought up as far as the local or the state cost share and how that plays into this. So I think it's a great discussion. I concur with Eric's recommendation here. I think this program holds a lot of merit. It's certainly going to allow us to relocate these farmsteads in a fair manner, given what we're up against with federal rules and regulations, and how we appraise the farmsteads and the buildings, and how the actual producers use those buildings. So I appreciate Eric for bringing this forward. And yeah, we are certainly looking for any sort of comments and guidance from the Finance Committee.
Who would like to take the step forward and offer a motion? We'll accept that now.
Tony, what type of motion are you looking for? To accept the land management or Eric's document as a policy, or where are we headed with it?
Well, I'm, thank you for the question. I mean, I have my thoughts, but I'm really deferring to what, the members of the committee feel. Kind of like I said on the front end, I'm not comfortable voting for a $5 to $10 million range for moving anything forward. I could go an up to amount. That's just me. And again, does the committee want to have more information? Does this quasi move forward similar to what the Oak Grove? The Oak Grove was well vetted. It had a series of meeting and opportunities for everyone to absorb. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, this is the first time many of the members of the committee have heard this. And so I'm really, looking to them for their thoughts on what, from a policy standpoint at the Finance Committee, what they're comfortable with. But, from a pure numbers game, I'm not going to vote for a $5 to $10 million range. But I'm open to anybody else's thoughts on how they want to keep this moving forward. Because I think it's important to move forward. But it's unclear for me what next steps should look like. And I would look to Eric and Joel for that, I guess.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry, this is Eric. Just a couple of comments on that, and I understand the points you're making, Commissioner Grinberg. In regards to the timing, I would maybe just point out again that we are currently working with a property owner that's impacted by the diversion channel, and that property owner would certainly be eligible for this program as probably the first one out of the chute. And I guess the timing of that acquisition, given that it's an occupied property and they would need to start building their replacement property so that they can get out of, vacate their existing location, that situation makes this somewhat urgent. And so I guess that's maybe why I'm.
So are you leaning towards maybe a phased approach?
Well, I guess that's kind of where I was going. The other thing I was going to mention is from the overall lands budget, what I've talked with some of you about is, we're still waiting for approval of the final mitigation plan from the North Dakota State Engineer. We should have that soon. And we're waiting for final approval of the hydraulic model from FEMA, which we should have that soon. And once those two pieces are in place, then we hope to engage the DNR, perhaps after the contested case hearing, and try to solidify a few of the other permit conditions. That those permit conditions really impact our lands program, where we need to buy easements, where we need to buy structures and houses, and where we don't. And I guess keep in mind that our current lands budget was developed in late 2018 based on what we submitted to the DNR. And the final permit conditions that are challenged right now, but those permit conditions from the DNR are a little bit different than what we had budgeted on. I generally think the area of impact, the area that we need to mitigate, is slightly smaller than what we had than what we had budgeted for. And so I think there's an opportunity for some cost savings in that regard, but at the same time, the costs per structure are likely ticking up a little bit above what we had originally budgeted for. And all those budgets were based on certain assumptions. And so I guess where I'm going with all that is perhaps a phased approval of this would be warranted, because we have some urgent need today. And I think over the next 6 months or so, we're likely going to have, knock on wood, some more certainty about the exact mitigation requirements that will allow us to do a deeper dive refresh of the lands budget. And perhaps then we could come back and determine, was the first $5 million allowance sufficient, or do we need to come back and beg for more, or, where are we at with the overall lands budget? So I guess I'd throw that out to hopefully not complicate matters, but maybe reach some type of a interim solution.
Mr. Chair, this is Rick.
Rick.
I just want to clarify, when I'm reading the letter, Eric, to Joel, the bottom of the second paragraph, and basically indicates it is estimated that the REMP will cost approximately 5 to 10 million above the current budget, which was developed in 2018. So you're asking for basically a budget adjustment.
Well, I think what I'm trying to say there is that I think there's an opportunity to review the 2018 budget as it sits today for these specific, again, the 24 parcels. If I look at what we budgeted for those specific parcels and I determine what it's, based on what we know today, what would it cost to completely buy out and reestablish those properties? That's where I'm coming up with the $5 to $10 million. That's just a snapshot of those 24 parcels that would be potentially eligible for this program. It has nothing to do with the other, 1,200 parcels that we still need to, work with.
So just my question back to you, Tony, is a contingency fund for this issue or not? I mean, you guys got a contingency fund in your land buying. This appears to me to be a contingency issue. It wasn't something we expected, but it came up. And so don't we dip into that contingency when this comes up?
Yeah, I would agree at a high level. But listening to Eric on a phased approach seems to be more practical to me than just giving a carte blanche, lump sum. We manage this, for the next 6 months on a case by case basis. I'm just, we got to move forward. I get that. I'm just trying to, the other variables here that it's, so.
This is Rick again.
Rick?
A thought on that, I don't want to stop the process in its tracks. I get that. We do parcel by parcel for 6 months. Pretty soon we've done 50 parcels and we don't even know what we spent. I think, if there's a sense of urgency here, that's great. I understand that we should move forward with what we have, but I do think that there is additional, perhaps the thought would be that 2018 lands budget, based upon everything, Eric, that you've shared with us and the situations and the environment, perhaps that entire 2018 land budget needs to be looked at, including these type of programs, and rehashed to make sure that we don't have any other surprises that we're looking at.
Yeah, I
won't get that done this meeting, but it may be by, before we get 6 months of parcels out and 6 months of parceling out this this budget, we have some understanding. So if we do have to make some type of budget adjustment, we're aware of it.
Well, I guess just two brief comments on that. I agree completely that we do have an opportunity to relook at that lands budget. I think it makes sense to do that after we've gotten through the contested case hearing and some of the DNR, permit issues, as those unfold. And then secondly, the one property in particular that I'm referring to is sort of urgent, and we've been working with them right now. There is one of the farmsteads that we have started working on. We've just recently completed the appraisal, and we're starting down this process. Other than that, we are not ready to implement or even close to implementing this program for any other properties. And so maybe just to calm a little bit of concerns or fears that we're going to be running rampant over the next 6 months, I really don't anticipate that. I think that we have one and maybe two properties that could dip into this in the next 6 months.
So Eric, Rick, I'd suggest you consider a motion. I just want to, what you said earlier and what Eric just said. So to move forward, what's the acceptable amount to move forward with the ones you have in queue, and then factor in any other lands budget adjustments so that we're kind of in tandem, but yet we're moving forward on the farmstead issue. So what's the number?
I guess from my standpoint, unfortunately, I think that this first one out of the chute is going to be one of the larger properties, and we're still working through the details of that. And so I guess I'd target the $5 million range if that's acceptable.
So then the motion would be something like up to 5 million.
Yep.
And then Rick's comments, if you can factor that into a motion, maybe that's how we start, see where it lands here.
And Tony, can we pull that out of contingency for now? Is that the way to do that, or?
Yeah, I mean, that's where it's going to have to come from. So it's reflective in that. Yep.
I'll make that motion.
I'll second.
Don, did you get that?
Mahoney and Steen.
Yeah, no.
Whatever that motion might be. Yeah.
Well, I know who moved and seconded, but I want to make sure she got the language of what the motion is. So. You need any clarification, Don, or you have it?
Yeah, go ahead and repeat it one more time.
Mayor?
Well, it's a motion to work on the two parcels up to $5 million out of contingency fund, and then review this, have them review the land budget as Rick clarified, and look for ups and downs. I know, and I think that's the end of the motion. I know in talking to Eric, we've got some land that we didn't expect to get at a certain value, and also getting some rental income as well. So there could be some adjustments to Rick's point that we might not be as bad as we think we are.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Further discussion? Hearing none, Don will take the roll.
Mr. Montplaisir?
Yes.
Mr. Peterson? Mr. Costin?
Yes.
Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Mr. Hendrickson?
Yes.
Mr. Steen?
Yes.
Mr. Redlinger?
Yes.
Dr. Mahoney?
Yes.
Mr. Grinberg?
Aye, thank you. Great discussion. Next meeting is June 24th. Any other business?
One question for Kent. How are we doing with the audit?
Well, I knew somebody was going to ask about that. Are you worried about your former firm or what?
No, I'm worried about the city of Fargo.
No, you don't have to worry. No, they are nearing the completion of their field work. They've been at it for the last couple of weeks, and they're trying to close up the loop on land acquisitions and such. But I think we're in good shape. I confirmed that we'll have the audit completed by the end of the month and should be available.
Great, thank you.
No other business?
Rick, when that comes in, would you look at it, please?
Be happy to, along with Kent and Mike.
Just for the good of the order, I just wanted to say that those of you that are looking for significant assets to show up on the balance sheet might be quite disappointed. because most of the assets, if not all the assets, are held in the names of other entities. So you're going to see a financial statement that looks a little skinny with just cash and payables with a lack of infrastructure assets. So I just want to plant that seed so that we don't have a misunderstanding when that gets ready to be explained. But we've done a deep dive with John Shockley and others about how this land is titled and where it's being held. It's held across multiple entities, and we can have that deeper discussion when the audit comes out. But I wanted to say that because I get a sense that some are looking for a huge number on assets.
All right. No other comments? We are adjourned. Great meeting, great discussion. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.